Hey guys, this is Cade. Welcome back to the channel. And for today's episode, we're going to be revisiting a series of different horror films that are often considered some of the greatest horror movies of all time. And we're going to try to answer one thing. Do they still hold up? And since we have quite a few movies to talk about, for today's discussion, I am once again joined by our returning guests, Hunter, Felicity, and Chloe. Hunter, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Felicity, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
And Chloe, welcome back.
Thanks. Been a while, but happy to be here.
So to kick this off, we are going back to 1960, where we are going to be talking about Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. So yeah, this is a movie that I thoroughly enjoy. I think it's honestly one of my favorite horror films of all time. Arguably, I think it might be one of the greatest movies ever made. There's so much to appreciate about it. The acting, the direction, the cinematography, the overall plot, and how it builds suspense, and definitely the twist ending. And for all of you, has it ever been one of your favorite horror movies of all time?
I don't know if it would be one of my favorites, but it's definitely like my favorite out of the ones we're discussing today. I think it's like always stuck with me, and I watched the TV show. I don't know, I always thought it was interesting, and everybody like always hypes it up, and I felt like it delivered when I saw it for the first time. I think it's unfortunate though sometimes in like our generation we have like a lot of the plot twists ruined for us before we ever see the movie. And so I think I knew the ending before I even saw it, but I saw it because I felt like I needed to watch it.
Yeah, I feel like I love Psycho and it was like it still holds up even like cinematography wise. I feel like there were a lot of things that they did in that movie that was like very innovative for the time. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like Psycho was like one of the first movies that I watched that I was like, "Oh, like I think I want to get into film and like cinematography specifically because I was in like a film class in high school that I just like randomly took because I thought it was going to be easy. And we watched Psycho and I was like, oh my God, like there is so much that you can do with like a single frame. Yeah. So I love that movie.
Yeah, and one of the best things about this movie, in my opinion, is definitely the character of Norman Bates. Aside from the character himself, there's also just the incredible performance by Anthony Perkins. And I'm curious for you as audience members, what do you find most fascinating about Norman's character when compared to other horror icons?
I feel like he was a different type of human because it was like you kind of didn't get to know a lot at first, and like you're kind of like meeting him along the way, and then you kind of start to have this soft spot for him and like feel bad kind of like for what he's going through. And then it turns out like he's the bad guy. And so it's just like I feel like you see it a lot more now, like recently, but I bet for the time it was like very like, oh, I didn't expect that to happen. And so it was probably really revolutionary at the moment, like, and I feel like watching it, I was like, oh, why does he have to be bad? Like, I really wanted you to like be good and stuff. Like, it reminds me of I think it's called like The Last House on the Left. Yeah, and it's like you think like the guy's good, and then like you're just like, oh, well, now I'm rethinking it, and you're like, oh, you just want it to end well. You're like, can this not be a horror film? Can this not be that? Like you just, and then it's like, oh, well, guess we can't really hope for the best with him anymore. Is kind of how I felt.
Yeah, I feel like I was gonna say it's like we are seeing him as just like this normal guy that we kind of feel bad for, like he's all alone. And then we have that twist at the end. And I feel like for the time, like that was so like it hadn't really been done before. And I feel like that's why this movie is so iconic because a lot of things that they're like introducing and themes and like just everything are things that had not been done for the time. So I feel like now we have a few more movies that like do portray that like, oh, this like person that we don't think is going to end up being the bad guy ends up being that. But yeah, it was just like so revolutionary. Like you had never really seen that. Like if there was a monster, like the monster was the monster. The monster wasn't like this guy that's trying to help you.
Well, and this movie also had a really huge influence on the slasher genre, and especially the ones that we'll talk about later. With that in mind, would you argue that this is the best slasher movie ever made?
I personally wouldn't say it's the best slasher film ever made. I think it's like revolutionary for the time. And then over time, I feel like people can perfect it and then it starts to get tired. I know my favorite one is probably Scream, but I just think it's like classic. It's got like, I mean, so many of these films have like a cult following, but I would say like I'm just like a big Scream fan. And so then like the first Scream is like probably my favorite slasher film.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, is Psycho considered a slasher movie? I feel like I wouldn't even like say that it was. I feel like it's more like a psychological thriller. Like, there's not like, I don't know.
I mean, I would consider it a slasher film only because it's like a mystery of who the person killing people is.
Hmm.
And like he killed multiple people, right? So like
Yeah.
I feel like it still counts.
No, that's true. That's true. I just never like thought about it in that way because I feel like when I hear slasher, I think of like Scream, where it's like kind of like blood and guts and like icky. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? But also I guess you could argue it's like, at that time, it's like they weren't really, it was like the first time showing a toilet being flushed. Like they're not showing like all the blood and guts and stuff. But yeah, I guess that being said, it's not like my favorite slasher movie, but also like I don't even think that I have a favorite.
Well, to close this off, here's the one question that I want to ask first. Does this movie still hold up? Well, in my opinion, it absolutely does. Do you guys agree?
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
For sure.
I think it'll always be a classic.
Absolutely. And now moving on to the next movie on the list, we have Night of the Living Dead from 1968. Admittedly, this is not one of my favorite horror movies of all time. I still do enjoy it, and I agree that it is one of the most important horror films ever made. Has it ever stood out for any of you?
I mean, it's like iconic, but I am really not a big fan of zombie movies or alien movies. I don't know why. I've always just been that way. I think it's just because like zombies like freaked me out so much as a kid. Like in my opinion, I like the Billy and Mandy zombie episode more than any other zombie movie or TV show. Yeah, I think that Night of the Living Dead, it's like iconic and has some like great scenes or memorable moments, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like it just lacks for me for some reason.
Well, another thing is the zombies in this movie are actually referred to as ghouls and flesh eaters, and this movie is also credited with establishing the sort of portrayal of zombies in most films and television and gaming. And with that, do you think that portrayal ever would have found its way into media if this movie was never made?
I mean, it's hard to tell because like we didn't live then, so it's like hard to know what like if there was anything before this that like slightly resembled it or if this is like because you're saying like this is the first like sign in film and stuff, but I'm like, was there anything like different form of media where this was? Because I mean, there's like Day of the Dead and stuff like that. Does that like would that cross over a barrier at some point, you know? So I feel like it would eventually become a thing.
Well, final question. Does this movie still hold up? In my opinion, for the most part, yes, it does still hold up. There are some things that I'm not a huge fan of, but I still think it does. But do you guys agree?
I would say yes. I mean, I think like it's scary, you know? It's like freaky. Like you just like there's no goodness coming out of this one. It's kind of what's that other movie? Oh, the original Crazies. It kind of reminds me of that, like in the sense of like, yeah, there's really no like happy ending here, huh? You know? Like it's always if something ends badly like that and it's also just like so rural, you know? It's always gonna be freaky. I think anything rural like that like always freaks me out.
Well, moving on to the next movie, we're going to 1973, where we're talking about The Exorcist. I actually have kind of a strange relationship with this movie. The first time that I watched it, I actually didn't enjoy it. I can't really explain why, it just didn't really work for me that time. But then I watched it again sometime later, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I appreciated it a lot more than I did the first time. I think it has a really good story to tell, and I do enjoy all the characters in it. And I'm curious, where does it sit with all of you?
Yeah, no, I saw it, I feel like relatively young. I don't know, I always thought like it stuck with me. I mean, I feel like I saw a lot of horror movies at too young of an age. Everyone always said it was like iconic. I feel like this and like Poltergeist, people always say is like iconic and stuff like that. And like I saw Poltergeist and I was like, man, I don't know. It's just like not, doing it for me. But I felt like The Exorcist was a little better just because like I think after it sort of started my spark for like exorcism movies. Like I definitely went on like a fleet of them afterwards and they're very iconic. I mean like I don't know if this is the OG, but like if it is like, makes sense. And I feel like I've seen so many now because of it. Like me and Hunter literally like at her family Christmas last year, I'm pretty sure we watched like an Exorcist movie with like her whole family. Like it's not The Exorcist, but it was like a different exorcism
And
like type
trolls.
movie. Yeah. So like I'll always watch one, but you think it would get old because like I kind of always know how it's gonna end. I don't know. I just love like the design of it all and like the gross things that happen, I think are just funny. I find it more funny than scary, to be honest, most of the time. I don't know, because I just think it's so like outlandish that I just like I don't know. I feel like it was appalling for people then, but for now, for me, I'm like this is kind of haha. I don't know why, but like when I see ones from like nowadays, I'm like, that's freaky. I don't like that. I don't know. I just feel like they're scarier now than the original is.
Yeah, I feel like this is one of those movies again where it's like, yeah, definitely watch this at like way too young of an age. So it kind of just sticks with me in that regard. Is I don't want to say it feels like nostalgic because I feel like that's crazy, but it kind of does in a way. But yeah, I still love this movie. I feel like all these movies that we're kind of talking about, like to Felicity's point, they do kind of now feel a little bit like goofy or like campy just because of like, the types of movies that we have now and the, I guess, like technology we have now to like make things feel scarier. But yeah, I remember watching this for the first time and being freaked out. But also, like, the only movies that like freak me out are like Exorcist movies. Like, no other, like, I don't get scared at like slasher films. Like, I don't get scared at like blood and guts. Like, it's like the demonic stuff that really, really gets to me.
Yeah, I think to like Hunter and Felicity's point, the taste for horror is always just going to rise and rise and rise because of the technology and like what we've been pre-exposed to and like even like coming like at a wide range to social media. Like people are being way more exposed to way more ideas. And I just think the scariness of horror will always just continue to rise. Like things that have been done before that haven't been seen or haven't been like put from a certain perspective. Like you can always skew that, but there to a degree, there'll be things that's like, oh, well, I've seen that before. Like it's less scary to me.
Yeah, and this movie also has a lot of disturbing scenes to it, and this includes the crucifix scene, the vomiting scenes, or the spider walk down the stairs. And looking back, has there ever been one scene in particular that disturbs you the most?
I I like really love the vomiting scene, and not because it like disturbs me the most, but I'm just like, as someone that like works like on set in production, it's just like, oh man, like doing that on set must be like so fun but so messy, and I just like love all the practical effects that they do because I'm just like thinking about in my own work, I'm just like, oh my God, that is so cool. How did they do that?
I would say the one that freaks me out the most is probably the crucifix scene. The vomiting one, like I don't mind as much, but yeah, like that one was just like a one for me.
Honestly, yeah, like what Hunter was saying about the exorcism and like anything demon related like scaring her the most. Like I definitely agree with that because it is one of the unknowns. Like is it or isn't like it's something that could like infiltrate your own life.
Yeah, I have to usually watch something like nice after I watch a horror movie because I'm like, I can't sleep knowing this.
Right. Exactly.
Well, and this movie is also an adaptation of the novel from 1971. And unlike a lot of adaptations, this film is also written by the author of the book, William Peter Blatty. And other film adaptations that did have the author involved in the writing process include films like The Godfather, Goodfellas, Jurassic Park. And this movie even won Best Screenplay at the Oscars. So do you think that might be one of the reasons why this movie was so successful as it was, because it was also written by the author?
Probably. I feel like when an author has it's their own hand in something that was, if their book was successful, the film will be successful if it follows the book. When you change it, everybody hates it. So, and if it's a good, like a really good book, like moving, then I would see that because like I don't know, I feel like you get all these like romance novels and like yeah, sure you could follow it like word for word, but it doesn't mean it's like a classic, you know?
I think from a writer's perspective, anything is going to be like feel truer to the original story if it comes from the original mind. It depends on how, I guess, the original writer is with understanding the film world and adaptation and just kind of like everything that goes into that. I'm sure, I mean, you can definitely have a writer that just doesn't get that you can't have a 4 hour movie. Like you need to include certain things and not include certain things. But yeah, I think there's a lot of value if the writer has a good film understanding and has the right guidance to be able to do it and have most of their hand in that process.
Well, to close off on this movie, do I think that this movie still holds up? Absolutely. I think it definitely still holds up.
I agree.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, moving on to the next movie, we're going to 1978 with the original Halloween. So this is often regarded as one of the best horror and slasher films ever made. It's also regarded as one of the best films by John Carpenter. And looking back at this movie, what do you think makes this film better than other slasher films?
Like you don't emotionally connect with this villain So I don't know how many were before this, besides like, talking about Psycho. With that one, we emotionally connected to that person. And then with this one, you're like, not really. Like, you see like the beginning and stuff, and obviously there's all of that. Like, that like at one point it was like normal, quote, quote. But yeah, I think it's just like interesting kind of like how this all plays out. And then he just like keeps coming back, and you never know when he's gonna show up.
Yeah, I feel like it almost like reminds me of Jaws in some ways, of where it's like we're getting kind of the same theme within the score. And I feel like the score in this movie is so iconic and very influential. And I feel like that's when you think of Halloween, you just think of like the score. I feel like that's the first thing that I think of. But yeah, it's kind of similar because it's like you aren't really seeing who the killer is, and it's like a mystery almost. Who is this? Why did they become the way that they are?
Well, and one thing that makes Michael Myers stand out as a character and as a slasher is that his backstory is more of a mystery to us, especially when you compare him to other characters like Norman Bates or Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees, who all have clearer backstories. Personally, do you think not knowing everything about Michael makes him scarier as a character? Because sometimes not having all the answers and having that element of the unknown is a good thing.
I actually do have something to say about that because one of my favorite things that any director can do or writer, obviously there's like a cutoff, but to leave the audience with enough space and room to like make their own emotional connections and relate it to their own lives and fill in kind of the spaces that you don't have with their own imagination. And I think that makes the experience unique to each person and heightens their own understanding and the things that they fear.
Yeah, I feel like it's like not knowing is interesting, and I feel like it would take away from the movie almost if we like knew. And we do get like a little bit of a backstory, but we don't really get like the psychology of like why he became how he is. And that is like also a big point in some of like the remakes. So I think it's interesting in this movie. I don't know, it leaves little like breadcrumbs for like the later movies.
Well, and this movie also includes the character of Laurie Strode, who's often considered one of the best final girls in horror movies. And other characters like this include Sally from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or Nancy Thompson from Nightmare on Elm Street, Sidney Prescott from Scream. And I'm curious, do you consider her one of the best protagonists when it comes to horror films?
I mean, maybe I would feel that way if I had seen all of them. Jamie Lee Curtis, right? Like, I love her in most things. And so I feel like if I had seen all of them and like seen her arc in this, I would feel more emotionally connected to her. But for me, since I haven't seen all of them, it's not like that big of a moment, especially in the first one. Like, I'm very proud of her, but I feel like I'd be more proud later on if I'd seen them all.
Yeah, I think she's iconic 'cause it's like Jamie Lee Curtis. But if I'm adding like all of like the Halloween stuff together, and I'm not just talking about the like original Halloween, her character as a whole like kind of irritates me. Yeah, I don't know. I like recently watched like I think the newest Halloween where it's like her daughter and her like granddaughter, and she just like kind of pisses me off a little bit. I feel like she like yeah, so I don't know. I feel like if we're adding it all together, she's like not my favorite.
Well, to close this off, do I think that this movie still holds up? I think it absolutely still holds up. I think it's definitely an iconic film. It'll always be a classic, in my opinion. Does it hold up for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Well, moving on to the next movie, we have The Shining from 1980. Admittedly, this is not one of my favorite horror movies of all time. I still do really enjoy it, and I think it's definitely a classic. I love the acting, the cinematography, and especially the production design. That being said, while I do enjoy the acting, I'm not always as invested in the characters like Jack and Wendy, the two parents, although I think that Danny is a great character. Looking back, has it ever been one of your favorite horror films?
I like don't think I really loved it when I first watched it, even though it is like this iconic movie. Like I like really appreciate it for like what it did, but it wasn't my favorite.
I haven't seen it in a little while, but I remember the first time I saw it. I've always been really drawn to character development in general. And obviously Jack Nicholson is like one of the most fun to watch kind of actors just because of his like facial expressions and like everything that goes along with him kind of delving into a role, but I did always kind of love the idea of like keeping the setting like very condensed and just the fact that it all happens within like the family. Yeah, I feel like the entire movie as a whole, like there's a lot to enjoy about it. I wouldn't call it like the best movie I've ever seen, but I definitely have enjoyed that movie and definitely still would if I saw it again.
Well, yeah, and actually, speaking of that, one of my favorite things about this movie has always been the Overlook Hotel. In my opinion, it's one of the best locations in horror films in general. When you look back at it, has anything about the hotel ever stood out to you from a production standpoint? Because one thing I always appreciate is how the hotel utilizes the color red.
Definitely that. It's very like, I don't know. I think the idea of being in such a large place with so little people, like it just helps instill that fear of there's too much room here for anything to like occur, if that makes sense. I definitely didn't say that very articulately, but there's a big canvas and they do a good job with instilling like a fear of the space and not just the human being.
Yeah, I feel like to Chloe's point, it's like this massive space that they're living in, but somehow like it feels so small. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's like feels so big that it's like anyone could be around the corner at like any time, which is kind of like a haunting feeling. But yeah, it also just feels like very New England to me, which I think like from a personal standpoint, like that makes it even creepier.
It's always reminded me of the Mount Washington Hotel.
Yeah.
Well, and although Stephen King does enjoy a lot of the adaptations of his books, this is one that he's actually known for disliking. The reason why is because he was unhappy with the changes that it made from the book. And when it comes to adaptations, do you think that they should all be exactly like the books, or do you think sometimes it's a good idea to make changes from the material?
I feel like for books, heavy plot points and character development arcs should be the same as the book. I feel like you can change small things, but I don't know, I feel like like the big points of a book or adaptation, like it should follow. Sometimes like with the Harry Potter series, like I'm like annoyed by changes that were made from the books. Same with Twilight.
Well, and to close this off, does the movie still hold up? Well, in my opinion, yeah, I think it does. Yeah, it's not one of my favorite horror films of all time, but I still enjoy it, and I think it is one of the best ever made. Do you guys agree?
Yeah, I feel like it's not my favorite, but it still holds up. And like, I feel like there's no way to remake it because, like, even though it's maybe not like my favorite, it's like still like very iconic. And I feel like remaking it would just like not do it justice at all.
Well, and moving on to the next movie on our list, we have the original Evil Dead from 1981. Now, aside from the practical effects in this movie, the movie is also really well known for how violent and gory it is. And for you guys, what is it that you think makes this movie so scary? Or do you think maybe it's more disturbing than it is scary?
It's definitely very disturbing, I would say. I think like this movie scarred me for like so many years. Just like the eyes and just the creepiness of it and just like this is the one where like she comes out of the floor like the head like thing. Oh yeah. Like this movie gives me the creeps if there's any movie.
Well, that's a good thing, Felicity. That means that it did its job.
It did do its job very well. I would say this is one of the ones that like actually freaks me out. Like I don't ever want to rewatch this or the sequel ever again.
Wow, I like watched this for the first time maybe like a month ago. So it's still like pretty fresh in my mind, but I just thought it was so like campy and it like didn't scare me. I was just kind of like giggling to myself the whole time, but it's still like so good. I don't know, there's just something about it that it's like, I don't know. So I really like this movie.
Well, and like a lot of the other movies on this list, The Evil Dead is a film that was made on a low budget. And for you personally, just the three of you, do you prefer more low budget horror films when compared to bigger budget horror films?
This is like a very small kind of add-in, but I feel like usually when, or not usually, but a lot of the times when someone's making, let's say, a horror film, for example, they kind of know their budget going into it, and it almost makes you have to be very creative about like, because horror is one of those things that you can really have the smallest budget and make like the thing that they fear something you don't see, or like there's just a lot of different angles you can come at it and it can still be a fantastic horror movie. It's yeah, I think there's a lot of room for people to lean into their creativity when they have to think about how much money they have to make the film.
To add to that, The Witch by Robert Eggers, with that, it was like kind of like his first like big feature, and they didn't have like a ton of money. Obviously, they had like money, but they didn't have like a ton of money. but I feel like that movie is so effective and it's so beautiful. And then he had The Lighthouse, obviously, but then he had The Northman. And when he had The Northman, I remember reading an interview and he was basically just saying that like it was his first time getting that much money and he had no idea like what to do with it. And I honestly think that The Witch is more effective than The Northman because you like have to be more strategic almost about like what you're filming and how you're filming when you don't have that much money. And then sometimes when you get like huge sum, you're just like, oh my God, like how do I utilize all this? And then like how do I do it the right way? So I think that's super interesting. But also one of my favorite horror movies is The Blair Witch Project, which is like no money and just like some kids like running around with like a camcorder. And I feel like that is like so scary to me because it's so like real and in your face and like it just doesn't even almost like feel like a movie, which is like the point. But I don't know. I like love that.
I think that I don't know. We like having been, like in film school, I think we all can like understand like making a film on a budget and like what you can do with that. It's like it's great to have the money, but sometimes when you have too much money, like you said, Hunter, like it's just like what do you do with it? And sometimes people just like make the wrong decisions. Sometimes I feel like with having less money, you can kill your darlings more easily and therefore like keep the really good stuff and leave out a bunch of filler or like things that are unnecessary. So I feel like there's good things for both. I feel like there are certain things in this world that really do need that budget or could have used that budget. There's definitely some films out there that are like pretty crappy that I still love, but like I wish that it could have had the funding that it needed to be really great.
Well, and this movie is also directed by Sam Raimi, who, aside from directing its two sequels, is also famous for directing the original Spider-Man trilogy with Tobey Maguire and many other films. And this is the movie where he made his directing debut. And looking back at it, what do you think was his biggest accomplishment as a first-time director?
I mean, he made me never want to see it again in the best way possible. So maybe like you said, he did what he needed to do. He made it really scary.
Yeah, I feel like I can't like pinpoint like what specifically. It's just kind of like the movie as a whole, he just did like a fantastic job on. And I know I keep using like iconic, but it is like a very like iconic horror movie.
Well, and to close this off, does the movie hold up? Well, in my opinion, yeah, it does. I think it's definitely a classic. And do you agree?
I definitely agree.
I agree. I still think it's like kind of fun and campy to me though, but I still love it.
Well, next up on the list, we have A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. This is another one of my favorite horror movies of all time, actually. I enjoy the hell out of this movie. I really love the concept and the creativity of the story, as well as how it utilizes horror. And has this ever stood out for you?
I do love it. It's funny, I kind of saw it out of order. I saw Freddy versus Jason. I think first, I know, terrible, but it was like the first one I saw, and then I went through a really big Johnny Depp phase, and so it made me want to watch it. And so I did end up seeing it, and I thought it was great. Like, it's just like scary and funny and has like the craziest effects. I don't know. I think, and it's just like a weird, I love those sort of like weird endings where it's like, is this real life or not? Or what's happening? I feel like yeah, just always stuck with me. And like, I don't know, anything that like makes you fearful of like everyday life is really like probably doing a good job. So like being scared to sleep or like dream. And then it always made me scared of like showering and keeping my eyes open. Like I had to keep my eyes open in the shower for years.
Well, this movie also has one of my favorite horror antagonists in any franchise, and that's the character of Freddy Krueger. To me, he's always been one of the best villains ever created in horror. Also, Robert Englund's pretty freaking awesome in the role. I always enjoy his performance, and I enjoy how Freddy is written as a character, how he can be scary, but at times he can also be kind of comedic. I really enjoy that about his character. Has Freddy as a character ever stood out for any of you?
I always wondered, how can you kill this guy? Like when I would watch him, I'm like, how are you gonna get rid of him? But then like when he came back, I was honestly like, I'm not too mad. Like he's kind of funny. I was like, this is kind of like what's he gonna do next? What's bigger and better gonna come? So I don't know. I always thought he was definitely interesting. He's very iconic.
Well, and this movie is also by one of my favorite horror directors of all time, and that is Wes Craven. And he's also directed other classics like The Hills Have Eyes, The Last House on the Left, and the Scream movies, and many more too. And has he ever been one of your favorite horror directors of all time?
Yeah, I feel like he's one of my favorites for sure. And he's like probably one of the most well known as well, since I love Scream so much, I definitely would say. Like and he's introduced me to a lot of other ones that I love, so I would agree he is, or for me he is one.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, I agree. Well, last up, does this movie still hold up? In my opinion, it absolutely does. Like I said, it's one of my favorite horror films of all time. And yeah, I think it always will be. Do you guys agree that it still holds up?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's something about tapping into dreams, like everybody dreams, like tapping into something that everybody across the board can relate to. That is so haunting and scary.
Yeah, I agree. And moving on to the last movie on our list, we have The Silence of the Lambs from 1991. And there's definitely a lot to enjoy about this movie. One thing I enjoy is how it's more than just a horror film. I also enjoy the mystery and detective elements that the film has, and we can see this through Clarice when she's pursuing Buffalo Bill. I also enjoy all the scenes between Clarice and Hannibal Lecter. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on the movie?
I love this movie. I love Jodie Foster. I love Anthony Hopkins. Like, I just think this is such a fantastic movie.
I agree, definitely one of my favorites. I think it's just got so many elements to it that just keep you hooked the whole time. And it's probably one of the first sort of like I would consider it like a psychological thriller as well, right? And I would say it's probably one of the first ones I ever saw. So it's always kind of stuck with me. And to have like multiple villains, similar but like different ones, and to just like get in your head, sort of make this connection and to make you question yourself, sort of. It's just got a very interesting thing to it. So
Well, and regarding all the scenes between Clarice and Hannibal Lecter, I think that Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster, like Hunter said, are just so incredible in the film. And with all the scenes that we see between these two, do you think that this movie would have been as effective as it was and continues to be if it had two different actors in the role?
No, it's crazy. I feel like some movies, the characters that they have are just like like nobody else could have pulled off that role. And also like the chemistry that they have with each other, like I just don't think that anybody else could have like pulled that off.
But one other thing that's very unique about this film is the fact that it's the only horror film to ever win Best Picture at the Oscars. And do you think that this movie is good enough to earn that honor? Or do you think that other movies that we've gone through on this list could have gotten that award before it, or just any horror film in general?
well, I guess I'm surprised that The Exorcist didn't, since like it got what for something else? You had said something about the screenplay?
It won Best Screenplay at the Oscars. It did not win Best Picture, though.
Yeah, that was the only one few that I was thinking like, oh, The Exorcist is probably the only other one on this list that I was like, that maybe should have.
Yeah, I feel like all the other ones, I don't see them being Best Picture, maybe. Like good ones, maybe Psycho if anything, but like that's like the only thing that I could really think of.
All right, well, to close this off, does the movie still hold up? In my opinion, yes, it does.
Oh yeah, I think it's timeless. And it's a little more modern than the other ones as well. And it's like right before like cell phones. So I honestly feel like the 90s is like a hot spot for like really good.
Yeah, I totally agree with what P said.
All right, guys, I think that's the end of this discussion. Thanks so much for listening. Chloe, Felicity, and Hunter, thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having
Thank
us.
you.
All right, guys, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you later.